I'm Michael Atkins. I don't get an introduction, but you heard my name mentioned earlier. I'm now at Georgetown and Deputy Director of the Georgetown Lombardi Comprehensive Cancer Center after spending 40 years of my life and majority of my career here in Boston. And this is going to be a follow-up session to the session we held at the 2022 meeting in Philadelphia, where we talked about barriers to minority and elderly accrual to clinical trials. And I'm here with panelists, some of whom were in that session. We'll start maybe at this side with Dr. Weinstock and have people just quickly introduce themselves.
Hi, I'm Chana Weinstock. Thank you so much for having me here. I'm a medical oncologist. I work at the FDA and I'm currently the acting supervisory associate director of the Division of Oncology 1, which regulates genitourinary oncology products.
I'm Jose Perez. I'm the medical lead for the GU portfolio in Exelixis. And I was here last year, so I think it's going to be a good second part of the discussion.
Great. Hi, I'm Kasey Estenson. I'm also a medical lead for Eisai, leading medical affairs in the US.
Hello, I'm Carmen White. I'm with Pfizer and I lead their multicultural participant experience team.
Hi, I'm Dana Walker. I'm with Bristol Myers Squibb. I'm the global program lead for GU and GI cancers there.
So thank you all. And what I thought I'd first do is just to get everybody on the same page, and rather than repeat the whole session from the fall, is just try to summarize what we talked about in the fall. And the panelists at that time were Dr. Weinstock, Dr. Perez, and also Dr. Harahan from Pfizer and Rick Baines from SWOG. And in that session, Dr. Weinstock introduced the FDA's concern that the overwhelming majority of patients on clinical trials were white, somewhere in the range of 75 to 87%, and that elderly patients and patients with a lot of comorbidities were often underrepresented in trials, and that global trials were even worse than US trials, and that kidney cancer trials were even worse than that. And then Dr. Weinstock also briefly mentioned, and she'll talk about this a little bit more detail, the FDA's Project Equity, which aimed to increase diversity in trial participants, and Project Silver, which aimed to increase elderly patient participation, and also to try to have these clinical trials match the population of patients treated in the real world. And she'll also talk about, she mentioned then, and we'll talk about again, the FDA issued a guidance in 2022 that required sponsors to come up with diversity plans for their phase 2 and phase 3 trials. So in that session, we spent most of our time addressing two questions. The first question was, how do we increase inclusiveness in patient populations in clinical trials? And a number of solutions were proposed. Jose here from Exelixis said that after seeing that there were only 3 African-American patients enrolled in the Cabo-Nivo arm of 9ER, that Exelixis establish a minority advisory board to understand how to improve minority representation. And that board gave a few recommendations. One was to be more explicit about what the exclusion criteria were, things like hypertension or diabetes, which are more common in minority populations. They wanted to actually strictly define it so that patients were needlessly excluded. They also wanted to come up with ways of relaxing eligibility criteria rather than having the same eligibility criteria for all trials, making that relaxed depending on what drug they were testing. They also talked about trying to gain the participation and the trust of minority communities by educational efforts, including those that might involve physicians. And finally, they talked about thinking about modifying the informed consent process to be more culturally sensitive and to potentially consider video consents and consents that were provided by individuals who sort of understood more what the patients were going through and could garner the patient's trust. Pfizer and SWOG both talked about efforts that they have involving patient advocates reviewing their clinical trials and reviewing their eligibility criteria and trying to make them more responsive and relevant to the needs of the patients. And then there were several participants, and including people from the audience, who mentioned that cultural barriers and financial barriers and things like absence of universal health insurance and things we now call social determinants of health were probably bigger barriers limiting accrual than some of these eligibility criteria. And that I think I had seen in a presentation at AACI just a few weeks before that session that when you actually sit down and ask patients who were minority patients why they didn't want to participate in a trial, their answers might have actually been different than what we might have assumed. And if you could actually hear those answers and come up with ways of addressing those answers, you might be able to enlist that patient's willingness to participate. We also briefly discussed what I think is a tension between pharma wanting to have pristine trials that minimize toxicity during the drug approval process and the FDA trying to ensure that drugs that they approve are actually going to be safe in all the populations where they might be used. And Dr. Weinstock at that session suggested that it would be fine with the FDA to have cohorts of diverse patients that were part of the trial but may not be part of the primary endpoint, that the package could be reviewed by the FDA and look at how safe it was in those patients, making them more comfortable in approving it for everybody rather than just the participants who were eligible for the trial. And then the second question that we focused a fair amount of time on is how do we get trials to the sites where diverse patients are? And Pfizer talked about their effort to try to get the trials open at HBCU universities, and also trying to help to remove the barriers to those sites actually participating in those trials. And there was some discussion about if patients are coming a long way to an academic center to be in a trial, maybe if we could approve local labs that were near where they live to do the blood testing, maybe that would minimize the burden of patients having to travel a long way. And then there was also the discussion about how CROs have been inserted themselves into this process. I hope there aren't a lot of CROs here, and made trials more complex, made them more expensive, which has limited the ability for industry to add extra sites and limited the ability for sites that take care of on the underserved population to actually have the staff to actually accomplish all the goals of these more complex trials. And so I think the bottom line was that if we were able to design trials with relaxed eligibility criteria and place those trials in institutions that see those patients who have our minority population, and have the trials presented in a culturally competent way, including asking patients why they're not willing to participate, and addressing the social determinants of health barriers to accrual, then minority accrual might increase. So that's where we sort of wrap things up. We had a few other questions that we were going to address, but we didn't have time. and we'll hope to cover them today. But before we go to that, I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Weinstock to just talk again about the FDA's perspective and maybe in more detail about some of those initiatives.
Thank you. Thank you so much. And thanks for having me back. And I think a lot of what you've discussed that we talked about in the fall is still relevant. I'm just going to give a little more context in terms of what's going on at the FDA now. A lot of it was going on then. I'll just reintroduce some of it. So there's been an ongoing effort at the FDA to make clinical trial populations look more like the real world population that will be using the drug. And those have been going on for a long time and have been formalized more recently with the Oncology Center of Excellence, Project Equity, Project Silver, et cetera. So those are the working groups that really deal with making trials more equitable and more diverse, et cetera. So I want to take a step back and really talk about why this sort of effort is so important to the FDA. And I think it really is twofold. So number one, we think that, we talk about underrepresented populations. We think that clinical trials are really a very good way of getting cancer care. And if there are populations that don't have access to clinical trials, then that's something that we should try to extend from an equity standpoint, just to give, as many patients as possible a fair chance at getting excellent care. And there's data that patients on a clinical trial do better just by virtue of being on a clinical trial and have access to new drugs that may not be available in any other venue. So from an equity standpoint, that makes sense. But then there's also the second part of it, which is, like I said, we want to make the patient population in the clinical trial as similar as possible to the patients who will actually be using the drug. So for those two reasons, this is something that's really been a focus of the FDA, the Oncology Center of Excellence, for a while now. And I think to do this requires a paradigm change in how we think about these issues in clinical trial enrollment. So I've been at the FDA since 2015. So I do have somewhat of an overview of how issues of equity and diversity were dealt with in clinical trial enrollment. And I will say that we used to take more of a retrospective look at things and how was diversity addressed in this trial? Does the trial population reflect the demographic realities that are out there in the US population? And I think the way this was done was retrospective, and we're really trying to shift to a prospective approach, starting as early as possible in drug development. So to think about this very early on, sometimes we'll include comments about a diversity plan and submitting that as early as a pre-IND meeting, because once you start talking about your registrational trial, this is something you really need to be thinking about. And often we talk about difference in metabolism and safety data in different populations, and that's something you need to be thinking about very early on in drug development. So I think the need for prospective thought about this is something we've really been emphasizing, and I think that's really one of the key differences between the more recent approach to this. And there are a lot of stakeholders who are with us in that approach, and it's a very collaborative effort, et cetera. So along with that, there have been several regulatory milestones in place. One of them was publication of the diversity plan guidance, which we talked about last year. So last year, it had already been published, the diversity plan guidance that was published in April of 2022. So it was already out when we had the panel last year. This talks about submitting a diversity plan no later than, ideally no later than at the end of phase 2 meeting, but it could really be at any point when you're talking about a registrational trial. I'm glad you're sitting. I felt bad that I was taking your chair. This is something that really needs to be submitted to the FDA as you're planning your registrational trial. So you need to talk about enrollment goals and the demographic information that support, what are the goals? What do you think the numbers of patients from different populations that need to be represented are? And that's all covered in the guidance. And there are a lot of aspects of diversity and clinical trial enrollment that are touched on in the guidance that I'm not going to delineate now, but there are all these aspects to think about early on in drug development. So enrollment goals, how you're going to go about doing that. We talked about this last year, but how are you going to make it so that trial enrollment is easier, and how are you going to facilitate this for communities that have not been traditionally represented in clinical trials. And then there's a requirement to keep track of this, right? You can't just say, well, we want to enroll whatever percentage it is, and this is what we think is realistic. We want to know how you're doing and how those enrollment goals are going. And then, so that diversity plan should be submitted, like I said, no later than end of phase 2, or as you're discussing a registrational strategy with us. What's new since last year is that at the end of 2022, I think it was December 29th to be exact, so right at the end, the FDORA was signed into law. So that's the Food and Drug Omnibus Reform Act. And it basically took what was talked about in the diversity plan guidance and made it into law. So now this is something that's a statutory requirement, as well as something that we were encouraging to sponsors. So FDORA, there's a lot of overlap between what was in the diversity plan guidance and what's in FDORA. It talks about enrollment goals. It talks about how the rationale for these was derived, and then how these enrollment goals will be met and how that plan is going to be enacted. So, and then there's also a stipulation that public workshops should be held to discuss diversity in clinical trials. So that's been codified into law. And so I think that's the biggest change from a regulatory perspective from our panel last year. And so, I think the why this is important, to increase access to clinical trials, to increase representation of clinical trials, the sea change of really doing this prospectively rather than retrospectively, and the fact that we now have a guidance and we have FDORA, which requires this under law, are really the points that I wanted to emphasize from a regulatory perspective. And we did a panel on this at ASCO on this topic, talking about diversity in kidney and bladder cancer trials. And, really one thing I found was that the information related to ethnicity was not always public. I actually had to look through some of our own FDA data to come up with accurate numbers for representation on clinical trials. And for example, for kidney cancer trials for combination therapy in the first line, our numbers showed that when we combined 4 of these trials, only 1.6% of enrolled patients were African American. So, if you don't have the data available, you might not even be aware of the extent of the issue, but we really would like to do better. And now there's more basis for that based on FDORA, the diversity plan guidance. And, it's going to require a lot of collaboration, certainly for smaller companies, collaborating with data that's been available, for example, demographic data on rarer subsets of kidney cancer and all of that from maybe larger pharma companies, et cetera. So collaborative, prospective, cooperative approaches are going to be essential here. So I'll open
Let
up
me
to
just ask you
questions.
one question. So how is FDORA playing in Florida?
Of course, I think disappointing. When you say kidney cancer, 1.6% African American, definitely lower than the incidence of African American in the US. That's when you consider all trial renal cell cancer in the US population, correct? Or the European, because, imagine
Right.
all over the world that just by how the country also maybe the number should be just focused on American sites. So what was that 1.6%?
So that's an aggregate of all
Yeah.
patients enrolled, and the number of patients enrolled from the US was, I think, about a quarter to a third of these trials. So that's part of the problem. As trials move to international enrollment, this can be more of an issue. There are ways to deal with this issue, or there are ways to account for these issues even in international trials. But I think it's something we're cognizant of even more as trials move outside the US, and it's something we're looking at.
Okay.
So I just wanted to call on the panelists and see if you had anything else to add before we go on to the next set of questions, to the first two questions that we addressed in the fall, which once again are, how do we increase diversity to patients accrued in trials, and how do we get trials open in places where they take care of diverse populations? So anyone else want to add anything to that discussion?
I can kick it off.
Sure, Kasey, go ahead.
Yeah, thank you. So I'm not sure, I think a lot of you know here, but at Eisai, our core mission is human healthcare. So if you've ever seen HHC, little HHC for us, that's what it means. And that means that we put the forefront, patients at the forefront of everything we do to increase the benefit for healthcare for those patients. And so thinking about the diversity plans that were created, and we of course have created them and submitted them, definitely looking at the under-repressed patient populations. We've also looked at, incorporating patients' thoughts and ideas into our clinical trials. So we do that by allowing input into the protocol designs and the trial designs. So that's one of the ways that we've also added benefit there.
Great. And anything from BMS, since you weren't on the panel last time?
Thanks for the opportunity. Mike.
Sure, Dana.
Well, I think probably like many of the other panelists and the other, pharma companies, we hear what FDA is saying, we hear what physicians and patients are saying, and, much like Kasey has just mentioned, we have our own diversity and clinical trial initiatives, and we've seen, improvements, and we've set metrics for ourselves over the last several years, and, in 2022 alone, we've increased our enrollment in minority populations by 22%. And, with our most recent metric and numbers, we've been able to have about 58% of our sites in what would be considered racially diverse areas and sites. So, I think we're on our way there. By no means is it perfect, but I think, continuing to work together, we'll get there. And I think our big focus has been US over the last couple of years. I think for 2023, a big focus of ours is, going ex-US as well. And while I understand that may dilute some of the diversity numbers in terms of African Americans, I do think it's important. And one of our big goals is diversifying our geographic footprint as we continue to move into countries where we didn't typically have sites and enroll patients. So it's another area where we're trying to continue to evolve.
That's great. Jose, did you want to add anything? Or should
I
we
think
move on?
that those were the two questions we discussed last year. And I think question number 3 is, what have we done since the last time we met based on the FDA requirements? So I have one question before we move to question 3.
Okay.
I mean, all these requisites are US only. So we are not thinking outside of the US of diversity, because that also will complicate more the situation.
No,
So
I
your
wanted
que-
Hannah to answer that question first.
So your
Sure.
question is, how do these recommendations or requirements apply to trials that are being done ex-US? So I think there's a lot to be said for trying to do enrollment in the US, partially to address some of the issues of diversity and applicability to the US population. We are aware, like I said, that the trials are global, and that needs to be accounted for when we think about these trials, but it doesn't absolve the trials from the need to account for enrollment of a diverse population, and the fact that this is a US requirement and maybe not a requirement of other regulatory agencies. I mean, it is what it is, but you know, we are aware of the global milieu of how things are done, but you know, I think we were beginning to see trials that were done completely ex-US, and you know, this is definitely a challenge in those sort of trials. So, you know, I think to as large an extent as possible, this is something that really needs to be considered. And like I said, there are ways to increase diversity of trial enrollment, even in ex-US sites. But, you know, and that can be accounted for in the diversity plan as well. You know, we're going to enroll in this country, and we expect the ethnic or racial makeup of those communities to look like this or this. There are some challenges with that as well, because, you know, the milieu that patients in that country are facing may not represent the same as in the US population, even if it's a population that otherwise might be similar. So there are issues, and it's something that we will look at in the diversity plan and the rationale for all of that.
And also another thing that could complicate the discussion is that we are thinking of, oh, I was born in XYZ country, and for that reason, I am one of these minorities. But if I look my genes, I am different than the place where I was born. So of course, we are going to try to solve the issue by allowing patients from different places that they were born. But I'm not sure that that really solves the difficulties that we may be recruiting patients that are all from European heritage.
So Nazar, you had a question before we get on to our question.
Dr. Weinstock, I mean, obviously, we all recognize the importance of recruiting minorities to the trials, but there is also, and the question is, do you have data about patients, the Caucasian patients, the 90% of the patients who are Caucasian enrolled in trials, how many are from rural areas? Because I think, again, probably if 2/3 of patients with cancer, or maybe half are in rural areas. I practiced in a very rural area in Kentucky, and I'll tell you that patients don't have access to a clinical trial. So a lot of those white or Caucasian patients enrolled are from the big cities or, you know, smaller cities, but not in rural America. And so how do we address that? Because that's also an important issue.
Yeah, so we didn't talk much about that last time, the issue of equity, but Chana, do you want to talk about that? Does anyone else want to bring up that equity access question?
So I can speak a bit to that. So we are really working to ensure that we're incorporating like decentralized clinical trial practices into our study conduct, aligning investigators with PIs who may be in more rural communities, taking the care when we look at our criteria and the procedures of the patient, what things can be done outside of the office, what things can be done by a mobile unit, what studies facilitate the delivery of that. So we are taking all of those things into consideration and incorporating them into our patient engagement and trial delivery plans.
I think that's a definite issue as well. And decentralized clinical trials are something we've really focused on a lot at the FDA, especially after COVID-19 and some of the practices that were done during COVID and how to bring those forward and make clinical trial access more available to patients who maybe were not in an area where a major academic center had a trial open, et cetera. So thank you for bringing that up.
Susan, did you have a question?
I did have a question. I really agree with what you're saying about where patients are served is a huge issue here in the US, and I don't understand anything about anywhere else, but has anyone really gotten good data and figured out how much of the minority disparity is coming just from what site patients are served at? Is there good data on that?
So every NCI designated cancer center has a catchment area, and that catchment area has statistics about what the percentage of minorities are in that catchment area and what the percentage of minorities with cancer are in that catchment area, and then what percentage of the patients who are served at their hospital are minorities. And in some institutions, those all match. In many institutions, there's a big disparity, but those cancer centers are trying, and they're charged by the NCI to try to overcome those disparities. One way in which we try to do this at Georgetown is to try to get our trials open up at Washington Hospital Center, which has 80% of their patients are minorities. But it's a battle every time to try to open an industry-sponsored trial at another site, even though that's where all the minority patients or the majority of minority patients in Washington, D.C. are treated, because that's another site. And they can't just count for many of them as our sub-site. And it's difficult to bring patients from there to an institution across town. And so that's something we need to think about. The way we try to address that is to do our own trials that address the questions that we want to address, but that requires support from somewhere. So even support for IITs to do trials that are relevant to the minority population and open them at hospitals that serve this underserved population, I think would be helpful. And I think that moves into our question that we wanted to address here, is to talk about what what your various institutions are doing to try to open up trials that focus on cancers, kidney cancers, or issues with kidney cancer that are in minority populations. And maybe we could start down with you, Dana, and see what BMS has done in this space.
You know, aside from just minority populations, I think a lot of what we spoke about when we were preparing for the panel was, you know, specifically around rare subtypes and patients that are hard to find and difficult to find. And I think, you know, you speak to some of the challenges. It's, you know, not just minority populations, but rare subtypes, and then rare subtypes in minority populations is even more challenging. And I think part of how we try to combat the problem around rare subtypes, or, you know, other challenging questions that we're trying to ask, is collaboration across partners. I'm sitting here looking at Jose, right? I mean, we're collaborating with Exelixis on a phase 3 non-clear cell RCC study, right? So, you know, working together to try to answer questions and prioritizing studies that are in, you know, the subtypes that aren't necessarily typically included in our registrational trials. But I think, you know, we still have to do better. And I know we talk about, you know, maybe having an arm of a trial that just doesn't, you know, contribute data to a primary endpoint. And I do think that's a space where we're going to have to start to look. And as we continue to have new assets come into this space, I think that's where perhaps these rare subtypes, you know, even if they're a separate arm of a trial, they're not part of a randomized population, just at least gleaning the data is going to be really important. And, you know, I think we just have to do better and continue to support the work of investigators and hear the questions that you're all trying to answer.
So Jose, Dana mentioned your name, and you're doing some collaborations with BMS, but are there other things that you're doing at Exelixis that address these issues?
Since last time we spoke, we have opened 2 phase 3 trials, and they both have the guidance for the increased diversity. And part of what that document includes, it's a table of the percentage of patients with different minorities that should be included in the trial. And as in many other areas, what you don't measure, you don't improve it. So we are assessing regularly the percentage of minorities that are recruited in those trials. And as a heads up, in one of those phase 3 trials that is currently recruiting patients, in the first assessment, we realized that 30% of the patients that were recruited so far are part of those minorities. So also, with the idea of increasing the understanding of the materials, we are going to translate materials to different languages based on the minority that we are trying to approach. And of course, and I don't know if I'm biased because of Spanish, but the first language that is going to be translated is Spanish. So that will ease the understanding of the materials and the informed consent from Spanish-speaking patients that are important in some of these trials. And these are things that we have been doing. And of course, I think that this is something that we're going to assess periodically, and we could do some additions to what we're doing so far. But I think that this 30% of patients included in minority is much higher than 3 patients with African-American heritage that we had in the 9-year trial.
Okay. Could you mention those trials, what they are?
Yes, I mean, the 2 phase 3 trials that we opened this year, it's the Stellar 303 trial, which is in colorectal cancer, and the Stellar 304 trial, which is in non-clear RCC. But the non-clear cell trial has 2 sites that are active in the US, and I think that European sites are going to activate in the next months. So that's much earlier in the process. So the 30% is from the colorectal cancer trial.
Great. And I think, Kasey, do you want to talk about anything that Eisai is doing? I know you can't talk about B61, but I'll ask Laurence to talk about B61.
Yeah, no, thank you. I definitely think everything that Jose just said is also a lot of what Eisai is doing. So as I mentioned before, we do keep the patients at the forefront of everything we do. So we look at the patient demographics within our clinical trials. We look at the underrepresented patient populations. And if we see something going on, we're going to look at the protocols. We're going to be able to look at the review and make a protocol amendment if we need to adjust for different subtypes and different types of patients, including comorbidities, elderly patients, also patients with different minorities and different minority classes. So definitely always taken into consideration. That for specifics, some of the other things that we have done at ASCO, we actually had a survey for diversity that we gathered information. It was at our patient advocacy booth, and we gathered information to understand more about the challenges and gaps from a clinical trial perspective. And some of those challenges and gaps we were trying to create, as Jose said, language summaries and stuff like that. And that's, one of the things that we've also been working on. So looking at plain language summaries in clinical trials, we've also developed a clinical trial handout that's available on our medical affairs website. That is a clinical trial handout that allows our clinicians or any HCP to have a conversation about clinical trials with their patients. So those are some of the activities.
So Laurence, did you want to mention anything about B61 and the non-clear cell trial that Eisai has been involved in, but Kasey can't talk about?
So first I'm going to say variant histologies for Nizar here. So I think B61 is important because per se it's non-clear cell variant RCCs, and therefore it relates to rare form of RCC. So it will be enrolling patients that have diversity because they have different biology in those different tumor sets. And we heard that in the previous session. So I think it's important to have those trials ultimately being randomized, ultimately being for each subtypes. That would be in the ideal world, but that helps as well to cover more diversity because you will enrich with populations that are not exactly the same, given that these tumors are driven by different biology themselves.
And do you happen to know what the minority participation was in B61?
So I don't have that on top of my head because I would be merging everything. And once again, it differs. If you look at HLRCC, then you will have more female. And we know that in clinical trial for RCC, this is something that we need to look at. We also know that we'll have more African-American related to some subtypes, but I don't have the total number.
I think the other way to also think, and I know Chana and the FDA are working on that, on some eligibility criteria, losing them. So we have, patient now, I wouldn't living normally with HIV. We have patient with hepatitis, I wouldn't say with undetectable level, but I would say even where the experimental arm, you don't see anything where they could alter the hep C dose. They've been excluded on trial. We're talking about this. I'm not talking even about patient with poor performance status or brain metastasis. I'm talking about these. I think also this should be taken into consideration.
Well, I was going to ask us the next question before we get to question 4 is, we've talked about trials you're sponsoring, but there are a lot of investigator-initiated trials that are focused on patients with comorbidities, patients with HIV, patients with liver function test abnormalities, patients with other problems such as even immune therapy trials in patients with autoimmune conditions or patients with who have organ transplants or things like that. And are your companies sensitive to those type of trials, and has your policy changed in terms of supporting those type of investigator-initiated trials? And has that in any way resulted from the FDA's change in policies? So anybody want to add something there?
We are suggesting to add diversity language also in the investigator-initiated trial protocols. We have at least one investigator-initiated trial in patients that are receiving HIV drugs. So, I mean, there have been some, let's say, flexibility of those restrictions. And I hope that continue going.
And hopefully things like renal medullary carcinoma or things like that, that are rare subtypes that predominate in minorities, that people could propose those trials and that they would have a meet a receptive ear at your companies. Dana, did you want to say something? And I'm going to get to Carmen in a second.
Sure, and I was going to speak to Tony's comment as well. I mean, I've been with BMS for 11 years. I started working on Opdivo when we were still in phase 1, and I was actually the safety lead for 2 years. And I've seen the evolution of inclusion and exclusion criteria over time, right? I think there's always this balance of ensuring patient safety and ensuring that you don't kill a drug because you've enrolled a subset of patients who maybe aren't going to be able to tolerate it, right? Only 2 things will kill a drug, safety and efficacy. So I think we need to be thoughtful about that, but I would certainly say, you know, over the years, we have adapted our inclusion criteria and exclusion criteria as we've learned more and treated thousands upon thousands of patients with IO agents and understand. And, you know, I think our current protocols are reflective of allowing, you know, patients with HIV and hepatitis onto our clinical trials. So I do think that there's an evolution, and as we learn more, we do continue to evolve and include these patients. And, you know, and I think, you know, but there's always going to be that point in, you know, early phase limited patient data where we have to take a little bit more of a cautious approach, and then it evolves over time. And so it's really actually important for us to have the safety data in these rare populations, and especially in the early days of Opdivo and Yervoy. I mean, we had very large safety studies after these drugs were approved in populations that weren't studied in our clinical trials in order to be able to modify inclusion-exclusion criteria.
So we only have a few minutes left, and I want to get to Carmen, and I want you to.
I'll make it a quick answer.
Sorry, she asked not to be asked the question 3, so I'm getting to question 4. And just what is it that Pfizer is doing to help minority patients at the actual site, to help them be accrued to trials, and what sort of organizational changes has Pfizer made?
Sure. So I can quickly answer your question. I can't account for our investment in IIS studies, but we did do a retrospective that was released in 2021 where we did a 10-year reflection of all of our trials. I think 270, I may be off a bit, but when we looked at oncology, we looked at the breakdown of participation by underrepresented populations, and there were underrepresented populations across all minority groups, with the exception of the Asian population. We did a further deep dive to see why that may be the case. One of the things that emerged was that there is more reflective representation among oncologists and the patient population. And so that is part of the assessment in as we try to increase the number of minority investigators and change what we call it conscious inclusion. And that conscious inclusion acknowledges the unconscious bias that happens. Everyone carries unconscious bias. It happens in the patient engagement setting between HCPs, site staffs, physicians. And one of the top reasons that minority participants say that they're not participating in clinical trials is because they are not asked to participate. And so how do we work not only as sponsors, but help support our investigative sites to facilitate the introduction of clinical trials that may have been a mystery to many, but especially to minority participants. And most oncology patients who are minorities, their first reaction is not that list of things that we often hear about, trials need to be demystified, or, I have a fear or mistrust. It's really about the fear of the experience within these settings where they have not been welcomed in the past. So we're looking at that as how can we as sponsors and our sites as partners become more trustworthy, and how can Pfizer facilitate that? So we do that through investigator training. We do that through trying to build the workforce of tomorrow and diversifying not only our investigator pool, but also the funnel of clinical trialists, CRAs that are coming up. And last year, I think they spoke to our work with HBCUs, but we do have a number of fellowships to bring underrepresented populations in the workforce forward and try to do matching with investigative sites who are trying to engage minority populations. One of the other things that we've done in response to our retrospective is that diversity goals became something that was top down. So our CEO communicated what our commitment to diversity is, and that is that at minimum, all of our clinical trials will reflect US Census or disease prevalence, whichever is greater. And we recently published our framework of how we assess our diversity goals. So in the review of literature, real world evidence data, and census data, we review that and see what the disease risk is for the population as we make our assessments for our recruitment goals. And that is communicated early to our investigative site partners so that they know our priority and our commitment. And I'm really proud to say that our site partners this semester, we have tracked at 100% of our goal and enrollment for diversity. That is not always how it happens, but right now that is the place that we are in. And that is also because we've done an assessment of our inclusion criteria as well.
So we're low on time, and I think that was just a great summary. So I'm not going to ask everybody else to address that question, but I will open it up to the audience and see if there are any questions that people want to ask. Yes, back in the corner.
Yeah, Yosef Zakaria. I am a geo-oncologist at the University of Iowa in Iowa City, so it does not get any more rural than that. And I can tell you, like we are NCI designated comprehensive cancer center for the last 20 years. And similar to any other cancer center, we have been struggling with staffing and regulatory and whatnot. So if with all the complicated designs of the clinical trials and how much expectation you are asking from the physician or the patient, how would you expect a small center in rural Iowa to enroll a patient on a clinical trial?
Well, we have open conversations through our site relationship partners, and they meet with the sites, and we do an assessment when we're doing our ISRP or our recruitment plans about what does your catchment area, what does your patient demographic look like. We don't want to put unfair goals on a site if the community does not reflect that. But when it does, what opportunities can we provide if that's supporting grassroots education efforts, if that's funding clinical trial navigators? What are those steps that we can take to help get sites to that point? And it's not something that's done across all studies at this point. Everything is a test and learn, and we see what's effective and we modify and do an assessment afterward. But those are some of the things that we are trying to do. And I know all sponsors are.
the difficulties, in balancing how we design our protocols and the complexity of study visits, right? Is you're trying to balance a collection of correlative data and learning about biomarkers and learning about disease biology. And those can be for very rigorous visit schedules, especially in a rural area where patients may have to drive 2 hours just to get to your clinic. And so, I know at BMS, we've, it's come full circle. We used to have, these blood collections were mandatory or you couldn't participate. And then we eased off on it because we realized, we were losing a lot of patients. We were losing a lot of PIs who just wouldn't participate in trials because the criteria were too stringent. But I do think, we're continuing to try to work with our advocacy partners and hearing the voice of the patients to understand, how significant these barriers are, but we're also at the same time trying to balance learning everything we can about tumor biology. So there has to be some flexibility around how you schedule these visits and how many blood draws and how many scans and the like. And, we welcome feedback on those all the time when we come to you guys with our protocol designs.
Another thing that we discussed last year was the cost of patients traveling and how we can counteract that. And as part of what we are doing, we are reimbursing that some of those expenses related to patient traveling and all those.
And it would be useful even to have navigators at certain institutions to help to deal with some of these social determinants of health that are obstacles for. It may not be just the cost of traveling, it may be the cost of being away from work or having childcare or something like that could be an obstacle. So we have to close. I know we could keep talking about this for a while. Maybe there'll be a session 3 sometime in the future. But I want to just sum up by saying there's a lot that can be done by the FDA, by the organizations and sponsors, and by the investigators to help improve diversity in clinical trials. We've talked in these 2 sessions about changing the trial designs to make them more accessible to everybody. We've talked about trying to change the places where those trials are set to give people, a diverse population, more access. We've talked about changing the focus of the trials so that they focus on issues that are more prevalent in the minority population. And we've started to talk about what can be done at the local site to help patients feel more comfortable and make it easier for them to participate. And so it behooves all of us to be more conscious of this. And now we've heard from the FDA that it's the law, so we'll have to do it.
Yeah, I think I heard some very encouraging things about this, in terms of collaboration and top-down prioritizing of these issues. So I'm very hopeful.
Thank you. All right, thanks very much.